Good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure for me to be here. And please welcome my distinguished panelists. We have Warren East, Chief Executive Officer of Rolls-Royce PLC, and Ed Daniels, Strategy, Sustainability and Corporate Relations Director of Shell. Welcome to everyone here today at CogX, and welcome to you, Warren, and to you, Ed. Thank you so much for joining me here. Right, how to accelerate the energy transition. The energy transition is underway and accelerating, driven by public demand, policy, technology, innovations, and of course, economic forces. The greatest and fastest change will come from collaboration and broad coalitions of business, governments, and other parties working sector by sector to identify and then pursue decarbonisation pathways. So what does it take to unlock the potential or rapid decarbonisation across multiple sectors? And how can industry or policymakers most help to achieve this globally? And of course, Warren and Ed, that's why we have you with us here today. You're going to tell us exactly how. But I'd like to start by saying to you, aerospace, power systems, and the oil and gas industries are of course seen as large contributors to CO2 emissions. Before we get into the details of what you're doing to reduce that, from their history so far, what do you think makes Rolls-Royce, Warren, and Shell, Ed, best placed to shape solutions and help accelerate a net zero future today? Warren, you've actually been quoted as saying that this is the biggest technological shift for the group since the arrival of the jet engine.
Yeah, it absolutely is. And the reason I said that was because if I look at Rolls-Royce, then we are about taking stored energy and turning it into useful power. And we do that across a variety of sectors, including aviation, which is, of course, a very difficult sector to change. But we also operate in energy and the built environment. And we're well placed to address that problem because that is our specialism and our expertise. We've been doing it for decades, and we know how to do that going forwards.
And Ed, I'm going to ask you, it's a decisive decade. Emissions must halve by 2030 to limit global warming to 1.5 Celsius. What commitments have Shell made? And what are the biggest steps you're taking on this right now?
So, in Shell, I think is reasonably well known. We're committed to net zero emissions by 2050. But of course, we need to do more than that. We need to accelerate right now. I think the biggest gift that we can give is to build the energy systems of the future. So whether that's more power, more green power, it's hydrogen, it's biofuels, it's carbon capture and storage and nature-based solutions. I think we're working in all of these areas and investing very heavily. We've got a target that our scope 1 and 2 emissions will be cut by 50% by 2030. And then similarly, when we look at 2030, we've got an acceleration of our reduction of net carbon intensity, so how intensive our products are from a carbon dimension. But I think actually the thing I feel strongest about is our work in building the coalitions that you talked about in your opening remarks, Tania, about that this is not just about one company and what it can do. It's how can we work with our customers, with suppliers, with governments, in order to build those coalitions that decarbonizes aviation or marine or the heating and lighting systems of the world. It's not going to be done by single entities or corporations. It's going to be done in huge coalitions, and we're absolutely committed to playing our part in that.
And when you say that, Ed, just give us an example of what you think would be the best coalition for someone like Shell.
So let me use aviation as the example, because seeing as Warren's here. So in aviation, there's a coalition called Clean Skies. That's bringing together engine manufacturers, it's bringing aircraft manufacturers, airports, engaging with governments, engaging with the UN to look at what will it take to decarbonize aviation. How will we go from a business that is today effectively burning only fossil fuels to one that will consume biofuels or sustainable aviation fuel? We're building, for example, right now in the Netherlands, 820,000 ton facility to produce the biofuels that will power the aviation of the future in a low carbon way. But we need the policy prescriptions that will help provide a level playing field so that we can use clean aviation fuel across Europe and across the world.
What's interesting there, Warren, Ed's mentioned the United Nations there, and of course we've had the Secretary General of the UN, Antonio Guterres, saying that this is a catastrophe. If we don't do something about the climate crisis, it's the end of civilization as we know it. How urgent is this fight?
Oh, well, look, it's very urgent, and that's why, like Shell, we've been convening industry players for the last several years. And we've got a number of joint activities going with Shell. We've got joint activities going with your peers, because we absolutely need to act now. Now, yes, it would be fantastic if I could hop on an aeroplane and go to the other side of the Atlantic and have all the energy stored to do that in hydrogen on the aeroplane. And maybe, in fact, I'm pretty confident that one day that will happen. But it's a very complex system to make that happen on the aircraft. I can easily burn the hydrogen in the engine today, but can I store enough hydrogen on the aeroplane? And importantly, can I store it safely and economically? Well, if we wait until that solution, which is probably likely to be sometime around 2040, then it's too late. But what we can do today is make sure that the engines that we test all run on 100% sustainable aviation fuel. And by the end of next year, we'll ensure that all our engines in production are able to do that. Now, and then it's a matter of working with the industry like Shell to ensure that there's sufficient supply of that aviation fuel, because it's going to have to keep us going for long-haul aviation for decades. That's a big challenge, and that's what we're working on together.
And if I may, Tania, I can sure you can imagine, I feel and understand the anger, the concern, the hurt, and the emotion that is contained within the debate around energy transition and climate change. And we have to be on the front line of trying to explain how energy transition is going to work. And you've made the point already. This is about a coalition across industry. It's around the people who use the demand side of energy and the supply side of energy. And it's all got to be governed by really outstanding policy positions that will help us make the urgent acceleration to energy transition. If we can get ourselves onto the equivalent of a war footing in terms of what we do, not taking 10 or 20 years to do things, but doing them in the matter of months, I genuinely believe we can address this and make a real difference in terms of energy transition.
And Ed, you said it yourself, you're on the front line. Shell was sued recently back in March by Client Earth, saying that you're being sued for failing to properly prepare the multinational oil and gas company for net zero. How do you gain public trust? Because that's not obviously the first of lawsuits that you've had to deal with.
No, and I think the legal landscape is going to continue to evolve and develop. A tiny correction, that the Client Earth is we're not being sued by them yet. They have sent us a letter warning that they may sue us, so just to be slightly technically correct, and I won't perhaps go into too much detail there, given that it's a live case. Their conjecture is, you're not doing enough on energy transition. We publish each year a report on our energy transition, and we subject it to our shareholders to vote upon it. At the AGM a couple of weeks ago, memorable event for me, they voted 80% in favour of our energy transition report. Is it enough? No, I'm sure there's more we should be doing, but I think we've got our shareholders on side. But to your key point, I think we have to continue to engage day after day, explaining the issues, the challenges, and the answers to energy transition, and just accept the fact that we are going to get criticised, we are going to get challenged, but provided that is done in the spirit of an open dialogue, a debate, in wanting to get to net zero by 2050, I'm perfectly happy to do that.
And do you think that target, Warren, of getting to net zero by 2050 is really achievable? I mean, everyone's talking about it. Everyone talks about targets by 2030 this, by 2050 this. But is it realistic?
Yeah, it's absolutely realistic, and we're working on a range of technologies. As I said, we operate across a range of sectors. There's obviously a lot of focus on aviation. That's because it's a very difficult one to do, but we are doing it. In some parts of aviation, the solution can be done with today's electrical technology, and we expect by the middle of this decade to have a Rolls-Royce powered aircraft with paying passengers going on pure electric. Now that's a relatively small number of people for a relatively short distance, maybe 10 people for 250 miles or something like that. Going right across the Atlantic with 300 people is at the other end of the spectrum, and that's why we need the synthetic aviation fuel. And in between, we have hybrid designs and, as I say, a longer term ambition to make sure that we can deliver something based probably on hydrogen.
What are some of the priorities at Rolls-Royce PLC? You just made an announcement about small nuclear reactors.
Yeah, so as I say, we work across a range of sectors. Now, it's all very well to talk about synthetic aviation fuel. It's all very well to talk about hydrogen, but these are just a means of storing energy. Actually, to create the hydrogen, you need a lot of energy to power a process of electrolysis or something like that. And that doesn't just apply to aviation, of course. We're talking about using hydrogen as a store of energy across multiple applications in transport, in industry. And so there's a tremendous need for creating zero carbon energy. And that's what fuels the demand for things like small nuclear reactors. Of course, we have bits of our business which are very focused on renewables, and we have a microgrid business. We work on fuel cells as well. But renewables are only going to be part of the jigsaw, and that's where nuclear comes in as a zero carbon form of energy that we can do something with today. Large nuclear reactors, of course, will be part of the jigsaw, but we do understand there are some challenges with that, and that's why we have our small modular reactors to address some of those commercial challenges that exist around large nuclear reactors.
Even the word, though, nuclear, Warren, that doesn't invoke confidence with everyone.
No, it doesn't, and that's one of the communications challenges we have. I mean, the reality in our business is that we've been building versions of these nuclear reactors for the last 6 decades. It's been an uneventful 6 decades as far as that's concerned, and that's why we think we have the expertise necessary to scale this up. And when we talk about energy security as well, you can see that there's a need for security of energy, and nuclear comes in to help plug that gap.
You were talking, of course, about sustainable aviation fuels, and UK Transport Secretary Grant Shapps in May has challenged the world of aviation to deliver the world's first transatlantic passenger jet flight using 100% sustainable aviation fuel by the end of next year. Is that realistic?
Again, that is completely realistic. I mean, there have been thousands, probably tens of thousands of flights powered by aviation fuel. But today, aviation fuel accounts for just about sustainable aviation fuel accounts for about 1% of aviation fuel generally. And so what people do is use a small proportion of sustainable fuel in a mix. 100%, of course, is technically possible. We're testing our engines right now, and we have tested several engines on that basis. The challenge is having the quantity. Now, it's easy to get the quantity to do a single flight. Right now, for the industry as a whole, scaling up, that's our challenge.
There's 2 points I'd like to dwell on here. One is the chicken and egg problem of the demand, and then when are we going to build the supply?
Yes.
And I think Shell and other companies, we are in the process of building the supply facilities around the world. We're currently just building an 820,000 ton facility on the European continent that'll provide sustainable aviation fuel, so that's fine. But actually, the real point I'd like to get across is sustainable aviation fuel, as we best understand it today, will be 2, 3, maybe 4 times the cost of regular aviation fuel.
Yes.
So no commercial enterprise is going to willfully take on this, which is going to be an additional cost burden, without, I think, the policy and the regulation put in place that says thou shalt use sustainable aviation fuel. And so I think we're going to need policymakers and regulators around the world to think carefully about how, over the coming few decades, the policy will ratchet up such that by 2050, we've got 100% sustainable aviation fuel being used. It's not a technical challenge for the user. It's not a technical challenge for the producer. The fundamentals here is a policy and an economic challenge to make this the de facto standard.
And Ed, how do you do that in that sense? I mean, how do you get the government to collaborate with the sector?
It's not actually. It's not just about governments. I think consumers are an important part of this, and the views of civil society are truly fundamental. There are sectors of the aviation industry today that are prepared to pay that because their consumers are demanding it. I won't name names, but you can imagine famous brands that fly stuff around the world a lot for goods and services that end up in consumers' hands. Actually, are prepared to pay it. Working collaboratively with large governments, but also with civil society, I think that's going to be the key. If I give the example of Fit for 55, which is the European Union's desire to drive the energy transition faster in the European Union, there you see the beginnings of a sort of a policy framework that will ratchet up over time for the use of sustainable aviation fuel.
But then it really isn't the responsibility then on the consumer, and they'll be paying higher prices for this.
I think there needs to be a very honest conversation between corporations like ours, with governments, with NGOs, with civil society in general, that although there are areas of energy transition which will be more cost effective and easier for consumers, there will be areas where it's going to cost more, and the price of avoiding the terrible devastation that could occur were we not to engage in this is a few pence a litre on aviation fuel, or a few pence here on gas, or a few pence here on gasoline. That is going to be the price to pay of driving the energy transition. And I think we need to be honest about that and not avoid the conversation and pretend it's all going to sort of slip between our fingers and it's going to be easy.
Look, Warren, I think the crises that the world is facing today, and of course, post-pandemic, I know at Rolls-Royce in 2020, you lost billions in that year. How do you communicate to people? Well, you've come out of the pandemic, the cost of living has gone up, inflation is at all-time high, oil and gas dependence is, oil's at over $100 a barrel, there's a war in the Ukraine, Russia's invaded Ukraine, it's impacting food security as well as oil and gas. With all of these geopolitical and economic crises going on in the world, how do you keep sustainability at the top of the conversation as a priority when there are people in the world that they're just worrying about how they're going to actually eat rather than how they're going to travel?
Yeah, and of course it isn't just travel. It's quite a bit of that food that people are going to eat is travelling around the world on aircraft as we speak. So it is a challenge. I think there's different people perceive the threat in different ways. The younger people, for instance, typically will be more, if I look at our own workforce, attuned to this than some of the older people. But I would just there's a relative thing going on. There's a humanitarian disaster going on in Ukraine at the moment. Millions of people have been displaced. But if we don't solve this problem with the climate change, then there'll be billions of people displaced, and not at some far distant point in the future. There'll be billions of people displaced in this century, And so I think we need to get our disasters a little bit in perspective. And that'll mean lots of hunger, by the way, that displacement will be very challenging from a food production point of view for the world.
And Ed, when Warren talks about that and the doom and gloom and the challenges that the world is facing, Shell has been seen to profit from the conflict in Ukraine. The first quarter, $9.2 billion in profit. So what do you say to those that will look at that and say, how can you morally tell us what we're going to do?
I think we recognise, of course, we all recognise the cost of living crisis that is out there, and it's extreme, and we see that in both on energy and fuel and heating, and on the food side, and of course I see that myself in the communities where I live. So we're very alive to that challenge. I think as a company, our responsibility is to do our utmost to urgently provide the improvements and the increases in the energy supply that try and address some of the sort of shortages from a supply and demand perspective. Of course, what happens is that the entire profitability of our company sometimes gets falsely ascribed to, I don't know, petrol pumps in the UK or gas in Germany or whatever particular subject du jour. The reality is, of course, we're a highly dispersed company operating in 80 to 100 countries with enormous businesses. And if I look at our business and the returns on the capital that we've invested, we're investing, $25 billion per annum in trying to grow and sustain the energy system and grow and sustain a clean energy system. The returns on that capital are relative to many sectors in the economy are pretty modest. So it's not that we're sort of profiteering extremely compared to many sectors. We're making a return on the capital that we've deployed.
And how do you get over that question, Warren, in business of profit versus purpose?
Yeah, and I think the reality is that they go together. And so that's why, for instance, I have described the dealing with climate change as a fantastic commercial opportunity for Rolls-Royce. In that we see business opportunity. You have to make a profit in order to invest in the sorts of technologies that are required to deliver on the purpose. And we have a very clear vision that we can achieve net zero across the sectors in which we work. But it does take investment, and so I have no shame whatsoever about generating profit to spend on R&D to deliver the technology to make the world better.
And Ed,
we spent a lot of time sort of thinking about this in developing our strategy, and where we got to. I don't know if you've seen the work of Colin Mayer, which is around corporations answering societal problems. And the way we sort of articulated was our purpose as a company is to accelerate the transition to net zero emissions purposefully and profitably. And so I'm a little bit with Warren here, that I think energy transition, of course, is an enormous challenge. It's a challenge of supply and demand. It's a technology challenge. It's a challenge of working with a huge range of partners. But ultimately, there is also opportunity in there. And we shouldn't shy away from trying to grasp those opportunities and using that opportunity to accelerate it purposefully and profitably.
And Ed, just on that, it's vital to reform energy demand. Mm-hmm. How can this be done?
I think in part there's a lot of education that needs to be done. I think it's quite easy to, I don't mean to be disrespectful, it's quite easy to forget that energy turns up literally everywhere in how goods got here, how we got here, how this chair got made. And so I think we have to do a lot of education. But for us, and we spend a lot of time sort of literally reorganizing our company to focus in this way, I think it's sector by sector. I don't think there's a single prescription that says the answer to energy transition is X. It's because the challenges in aviation are very different to the challenges of air conditioning, which are different to marine and different to cement and steel. And I think we have to engage with each of those individual sectors and communities to have meaningful dialogue about what does it mean to transition your industry, your sector, through to net zero by 2050.
And we see a slightly sort of smaller version of this in the range of sectors that we serve, where some of them are, frankly, a little bit easier. So, one day, undoubtedly, we will, be powering hybrid aircraft. Today, we're powering hybrid trains. And the type of technology that you use, yes, is different orders of magnitude in terms of the energy involved. But it's absolutely the sort of system expertise that our engineers develop in tackling the problem in one sector, we can then apply to move across to other sectors.
And of course, you're both talking there about industries and different sectors and different industries. What about the individuals? Because it can be so overwhelming. How do you change behaviour?
I think the first thing you can do is provide data, information, and put it in people's faces. I mean, I think the stats on smart meters and showing people what they're using every day is pretty compelling evidence. But then if you had on a package of food how much energy this costs you, how much CO2 is being emitted from this food, or a rail ticket, or a plane ticket, or I think if we have at work, we have an emissions calculator, and you put in your life, and Bing gives you your own personal carbon footprint. And okay, that's an interesting exercise. But the real critical thing is, what levers have you got? What are the big levers? And for me, my big lever is flying. And so, but what other levers have you got? Well, it's take the train, not the car. So there is data that we need to put in front of people to help them make informed choices.
Of course, we saw during the pandemic, when people couldn't travel, that did actually improve air quality and pollution, Warren. But of course, from a business prospect, you don't want to encourage that.
Yeah, clearly we don't want to encourage that for the sake of our business. Flight has been a good thing for society for the last 100 years, however long we've been doing it. Actually, during the pandemic, of course, about very, very quickly, actually, after the first month or so, then the world was flying again, and our airlines were flying aeroplanes just for the cargo, because the rest of the world needed to keep moving. And I've referred to things like food, but there's perishable goods that can't travel by sea because they're rotten by the time they get there. At the moment, human society has worked out that we can have those perishable goods and move them around the world. And that has made the world better as a result of aviation. Now, what we want to do is not just give up all those advantages, because I can't actually think of many technological breakthroughs that humans have done ever where we've gone backwards. It just doesn't happen. So what we can do, though, is apply human ingenuity to make sure that we can have those technical advantages, but do it in a way that doesn't cook the planet. And that's what we're setting about doing.
Just to build on that, one of the things about energy transition that's the sort of less spoken about component is energy efficiency. That we have got to tackle energy efficiency in a massive way, and that brings a link in my mind to the role of technology and the role of artificial intelligence. I think we are completely underplaying the role of artificial intelligence in helping us make day-to-day living with energy much more efficient. And for me, I think that's a rich area of investment and challenge and opportunity, even though for a lot of people, energy efficiency feels a little bit boring relative to building a hydrogen electrolyzer or building a brand new facility to create sustainable aviation fuel. But I think energy transition, the urgency means we have to pull all of these levers as hard as we can, as quickly as we can.
If I just chime in there, I totally agree with you, Ed, and a lot of the effort that we put into engineering our products today is driving exactly that. Ed Ben pointed out that synthetic aviation fuel is going to cost more than digging it out of the ground, because we've got 100 years experience of digging oil out of the ground and refining it and so on. We haven't got all that experience of making synthetic fuel, so it is going to be more expensive. So if we can design an engine that means the aeroplane is 25% more efficient, then we can help bridge some of that gap.
And talking about AI, what role will digital transformation take in the path of decarbonising supply chains?
So I'll have a go at that. I mean, I think, but it's so broad. I mean, we could spend all day on it. But let's start, with.
So we've got a few minutes.
Okay. If we start with the sort of the process equipment that is manufacturing, whether it's biofuels or it's hydrogen or it's traditional, the making that equipment more efficient, more reliable, optimizing that full end-to-end supply chain, I think is a huge treasure trove of opportunity. But then if I get onto the power system of tomorrow is going to be multiple intermittent sources of electricity from wind and solar. It's going to be storage devices in multiple locations. It's going to be consumers who've got variable supply and demand characteristics, a whole bunch of EV charging hither and thither. To conceive and optimize that entire system to get the very, very best out of it, I think that takes some of the finest AI minds in the world. And that's before you've even begun to start to influence consumer behavior or to work back up the supply chain.
What game-changing technologies for both of you are you working on that excite you?
It would be very hard for me to pinpoint one. I find it very exciting to be working in an industry where we really can make a positive impact on the world by enabling all the benefits that we've had on the back of fossil fuels, but enable that in a net zero way. And we're very lucky to be in that position. And whether that is battery technology, whether it's fuel cells, whether it's making hydrogen actually work in an aeroplane, personally I find all of those hugely exciting.
So I have two different answers to that. First of all, I think the area of direct air capture, so capturing CO2 straight out of the air efficiently and effectively, and then also combining that to make what people call e-fuels or synthetic fuels, I think that's a really exciting frontier. It's probably 20, 30 years into the future. But I would also then turn the question upside down and give a little bit of a warning that there is a belief with some that all we need to do is find the widget, find the perfect widget solution. But actually, this is going to be grindingly hard progress of addressing every single component of the energy system and pulling those levers as hard as we can, which will include, yes, new technologies, but it'll include all sorts of our current technologies done much, much better.
Why haven't we started earlier? We're getting all these urgent messages, as I said, from the UN. Also last year, the United Nations Development Programme, they came out with a campaign where they had a CGI of a dinosaur addressing the United Nations and saying, what are you doing? If you keep going with fossil fuels, it's the end of civilization. It's taken thousands of years for you to want to end it. I mean, with all of this awareness and campaigns, why is it so urgent? Why has it not started before? When you look at your children, your grandchildren, and the world that you want to leave them with, why haven't the industries, the governments, the policymakers, the private sector, civil society, why has it not started earlier than this? And so that
a lot of us have started a lot earlier, but you can't. No one single actor can do this. We can build as many hydrogen plants, as many biofuels plants, produce as much renewable electricity as you like, and if nobody wants to buy it, then okay. I know we're accused of that commonly as an excuse, but the answer to your challenge, I think, is we've spent 130 years creating this energy system that we currently rely on and gives us all of the benefits that we've enjoyed for decades. And it's extremely efficient, and it's relative to everything else. It's extremely low cost, and so there's just an inertia that's been developed because the system is actually so good, and the externality to that system, the carbon dioxide, is dissipated across the entire planet and difficult to see and difficult to fully cost into the current system.
Yeah, I'd agree. I mean, it's human nature. We don't like doing difficult things. And Ed used the word inertia. I mean, it's the inertia of human behaviour. However, the good news is that certainly I've detected over the last sort of 5 or 6 years a tremendous change. And it talks about it needing multiple businesses and multiple sectors. The level of collaboration has gone up. The level of alignment between those businesses has gone up. So I'm actually relatively optimistic that we will do it. But like he says, the word is grind. It's going to be a lot of hard work.
And Ed, you were talking there about cost. And of course, what we're hearing more and more in the narrative is because of the rise in prices of oil and gas, and as a result of what's been going on in Ukraine, in Russia and Ukraine. What do you say to people that are saying, well, I can't afford the gas bill, I can't afford that, and I got to choose now, is it food, is it fuel? What's your message to them?
So I recognize the enormous challenge of a cost of living crisis in many countries in the world. And there's harrowing stories out there. As I've said, I think our role is to produce the hydrocarbons, but also the renewables as efficiently and effectively as we can to try and mitigate the supply-demand balance issues that we've got. And I would slightly correct you, Tania, that I think although the Ukraine war has exacerbated it, I think hydrocarbon prices are already on the rise. I think there's been a significant underinvestment in hydrocarbons that's led to a supply-demand crunch before Russia-Ukraine. This has just exacerbated it. But I don't think it's the role of a single private company to work with consumers on making the trade-offs between food and fuel, etc. I think there's a role for governments in trying to understand how they best play their role with the challenges that individual consumers are having.
And would you be happy with the windfall taxes then?
I think in terms of windfall taxes, that again, I would say that is the role of governments to choose how they choose to raise revenue and how they choose to tax individuals and corporations. I would respectfully try and suggest that we have to make long-term investment decisions for the investment in the energy system. And of course, when you're making investments that span 10, 20, 30, 40 years, to have highly unstable and unpredictable environment into which make those investments, it makes it much harder to select a country that is making somewhat arbitrary decisions on taxation.
Talking about countries, which country do both of you think will be the next superpower in terms of renewable energy?
Impossible for me to answer that because I think there are different solutions in different parts of the world. I mean, certainly viewed from aviation point of view, by definition, you're interconnecting countries, and we need systems that work globally. So I would say, there's pioneering countries. So I talked about the electric plane and the 10 people and so on. Yeah, that's happening in Scandinavia. That's because that's where they have the landscape that needs all those short haul hops. Other parts of the world are rich in resources to create things like hydrogen from sunlight. So horses for courses.
Before I ask my final question to you both, I know that there'll be questions from our audience. So please don't be shy. Who would like to go first? Yes. Thank you very much. We have a microphone for you.
Just in terms of, I suppose for both of you, not that long ago we were all focused on COP26 with governments and corporates making commitments for net zero and various other targets. We've obviously now had the Ukraine crisis, oil prices have leapt up significantly. So if we have a scenario where, whether it's the next COP or in 5 years after that, there's legislation that forces corporates to change their behavior, what's your scope now to accelerate your decarbonisation targets? So, for example, moving from 2050 to 2040 for net zero, moving from 2030, 50% reduction to 2027.
So I'll take a couple of stabs at your question. First of all, I would say if there was a level playing field, corporate, both supply and demand, I would love it. I think that if everyone was told this is the target for reductions, then it becomes easy because people challenge me on scope 3 emissions and what are you doing about it and why haven't you reduced further. If everybody did their scope 1 and 2, I wouldn't have to worry about it. So I would welcome that. I think accelerating from 2050, from everything that I know about the energy system, which is far from perfect and far from complete, I think if we pull every single lever as hard as we can and every government steps up to the plate and legislates as quick as they can, we can just about make 2050. I think to get to 2040, we would require changes to life as we know it in a much more radical way that I think it would be, for democratic societies, would be difficult to accept.
Yeah, I can't really improve on that. I mean, generally, if you want people to change behaviour, you need to set some ambitious goals. But if they're so ambitious that they're unrealistic, then people don't try. And so I think it needs to be applied gradually. And who knows? By the time we get to 2030, we might have made such technology and otherwise progress that suddenly 2050 becomes more than achievable and we can pull things in. But if we start off by setting unrealistic goals, then people won't start.
I think a lot of people want to get to 2023 first. Who's the next question? Lovely, thank you so much.
Yes.
Thank you.
Hi, Edmund Phillips, National Security Strategic Investment Fund. I think you both, at different points, used the phrase horses for courses and the idea of, niche solutions for the different parts of the problem, which kind of sounds a bit like fragmentation of what is currently, an enormous and efficient industry that delivers energy, across the globe. What does that imply for the sort of capital efficiency of delivering energy? And on the other hand, do you see any sort of cross-cutting technologies which are going to be essential in all those different niches? You mentioned, Ed, AI and the potential of that to deliver efficiency. Are there other technologies of that nature, like lightweighting in materials, those kind of things?
Yeah, I mean, if I look across the range of sectors that we have, the reason that they're different solutions is sometimes got a time attached to it. I've talked a bit about hydrogen, and there are some specific challenges around that in the air that don't exist on the ground. And so for those sectors that can have hydrogen today or in the very near future, then why shouldn't they have that in the very near future? Others, we have to take some intermediate step and for the next several decades go via synthetic fuel. Electricity is undoubtedly going to play a larger and larger part in the jigsaw because it's a very good way of transferring energy and moving it around. So there are a few.
A couple of adds I'd make. I think one's absolutely right. Electrifying everything we can possibly electrify is going to be the prime vector of decarbonising the energy system. The difference, though, between electricity and the hydrocarbon system is it's much less portable around the world, right? So it's regulation is much more local to national boundaries and sometimes sub-national boundaries. And it's much harder to transport electricity around the world, and it's much harder to store it. And so it makes the power a somewhat different commodity. Power is the first one. So any technologies that create, store, or can transport power, I think will be really important. And then you get into hydrogen. Again, that's a really important one. And I think we're in the very, very early days of green hydrogen. I think the electrolyzers are just nowhere near as efficient and effective enough in order to work. And to Warren's point earlier, storage of hydrogen and transmission of hydrogen needs a lot of work. And then biofuels, carbon capture and storage, stroke direct air capture, and nature-based solutions. I think those fundamental technologies, enabled by an overarching sort of optimization AI platform, I think those are the ones which we need. How they get applied in different geographies and different industrial sectors will be different in their blend today, and will be also different over time.
Thank you so much. I think we've got time for one more quick question. Any takers? Yes, here we are.
I know it's a slightly delicate one, but do you not think that part of the mix has to be less consumption all round?
That's my point on showing people, for whether it's corporations or showing the data of what people are consuming and an understanding. And I do think between energy efficiency and just the direct consumption is going to have to be worked on.
I would agree. And one of the things that the COVID experience has taught us is that there's less business travel than there was. And actually, it's just fine. And as the sector, coming from within the sector, we've got our heads around that. We talk about getting to pre-pandemic levels of intercontinental flight globally by 2024 to 2025. The rest of the world's economy has grown significantly in that period, and the gap represents less travel. So, we are learning to do that as a society. However, there's still underlying economic growth, and underlying economic growth means more goods shipped around the world, and so we need to find a zero carbon way of making aviation work.
Thank you. Just finally, to Ed and to you, Warren, what's your message? Obviously, the theme is how do we get the next 10 years better? What's the fastest way to do that? Your final message to everyone. Ed, I'll start with you.
Do you know what? I don't think anything brand new to add. I think the challenge of energy transition is the biggest challenge facing mankind, and it's going to take all of us. Collaboration, civil society, governments to provide the policy framework, and corporations like ours, like Warren's, in order to drive the really big, challenging investments that we're going to need. It's trillions of dollars that we're going to have to invest over time in order to make it work. But it's a collaborative effort, and no one sector can do this alone.
Warren.
No one sector can do it alone, but industry has a big part to play, companies like us. And I think it is that sort of an alliance of consumers and industry together can solve this, and governments can be the oil in the machine that makes that work.
Ed Daniels, Warren East, thank you so much for joining me here today. Thank you
very much.
Thank you very much.